I'm curious as to where the sacrality is, either in space or time.
Okay, so here's my answer for the Book of Esther. There is a Beit Mishteh. Okay, there's a drinking house that is at the center of the story, and this is where the story really shifts. Right, we have a flip in the story where, and there are multiple drinking events. We have different mishtaot, right? We have different drinking events, drinking parties that take place throughout the story, and we see this all change. That the story flips on its head at a Beit Mishteh, and that might be the sort of sacred space, as it were, of the Book of Esther, where it's sort of there is almost a perceived defilement, if you will, by Haman approaching or somehow following or somehow seeming to come on to Esther, that King Achashverosh, on his return to the Beit Mishteh, on his return to this drinking house, sees and is offended at this potential defilement of his wife. And obviously, it's a Beit Mishteh, it's a drinking house. They're having a Mishteh Yain, they're having a wine drinking party. That's my connection.
So I really appreciate that. One of the things that my answer was to Gabe via the chat in Zoom, letting you know the secret of our recording habits, audience, that we record on Zoom. And so my answer was, I think that it constantly happens at the gates, which I think is a really interesting thing when you look at building community in general. This idea of what happens at an entranceway or what happens at the gates. When Mordecai comes and he ends up saving Ahasuerus's life, that happens at the gates. When Mordecai comes to see Esther, that happens at the gates. When these messages go of you have the ability to make an action that will change you, that will transform you. And the first transformed Mordecai, though I'm not sure he knew that it would be happening. And the second transformed Esther into kind of potentially a pawn, although I don't love that word, into a heroine almost in her own right. Those things happen at the gates. And there's this, Gabe loves to talk about liminal space, but there's this liminal space that can be a sacred space of transformation when you're at a gate, of whether or not you're going into it, coming out of it, and what that might look like, and who you might be when you're able to enter, and who you might be when you finally exit. And so I think that even though, Gabe, you're absolutely right that, God's name doesn't exist or show up in Purim or in the book of Esther. And Drew, I think you're right that sometimes there's a lot of sacred moments that can happen in a Beit Mishteh, in a drinking house, when you're sharing confidences among drinking. For me, I think that there's definitely a possibility that, sometimes when you're on the outside looking in or when you're on the inside looking out, there is this ability to create a sacred space for others and for yourself. And that's something that I'm kind of really excited about. I'm not sure I've ever thought about that before.